Alright, we are coming up on 8 o'clock. So, let's settle in, get comfortable, and get into the holiday spirit a little bit. Welcome back. I have not updated the book or the drink yet tonight, so bear with me for just a moment. Alright, so this is The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus by L. Frank Baum, who, as you may remember, was the author of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. There we go. Let me get this realigned a little bit. There we go. Looking all pretty like. You know what? Yeah, things have been going a little too well lately. We need to have a little bit of a reminder that we're none of us professionals around here. And hello again, Stream Element Spot. Thank you again for joining us. Alright, we are on the mulled wine again tonight, because it's cold, and it feels right. So, this one was a bit of a surprise, actually, as I remember the story. It's another of those stop-motion, puppeteer-style adaptations that were big in the early 90s. And I remember the story fondly, but I did not know where it came from. And doing some digging, I found this. And also, it was a complete surprise to me that it was the same author as gave us The World of Oz. So, it's a double surprise there, because we enjoyed Oz when we read it, so we might as well enjoy this. It all seems to come together nicely, doesn't it? It may just be that turn of the century children's authors were rather slim pickings, or it may have just been that he was tremendously successful. A little bit of A, a little bit of B, could be. And you're right, I did too much prep for yesterday's stream, so this is just karma getting back at us. It's just the way it has to be. So, tonight is a little bit more whimsical, if being less serious than Dickens is the bar to be whimsical, then it's not a very hard hurdle to clear. But, despite that, I don't know that I have watched that one. Usually the oldest Santa Claus things are like Miracle on the 31st Street, you know? But, the middle range of old movies is a bit of a blind spot of mine. Alright. So this one is on the shorter side. I was looking forward to it. It might be a 2-night read, but it's, we might run it into one, but I think we have no reason to rush through all these holiday stories. So we can take our time, chat a little bit, and remember B-roll movies that may have been better off forgotten. Or that could be it. Oh, it's a good confusion movie. Okay. You know what? Sometimes you just need to shut the brain off every once in a while, right? Alright. Well, let's go ahead and ease our way into this one. We've got another... I will say this is a classic, but it's not to the level of something like Rudolph or Christmas Carol or any of those immediately recognizable classics. But many of us may have seen this adaptation, and may be interested to hear a little bit more about the big man. Now, I think I'm going out on a limb here. I think this was all spun out of whole cloth. I do think that Baum invented this backstory and history of Santa for the purpose of his story. And it does a very good job of separating Santa from the religiosity of Christmas. Because the holiday's grown well past that. And I think it's important to include everyone in the festivities. And this is one of the best ways to do it, is to have some good old secular help. Non-secular? I always forget. Secular, non-secular. Yeah, whatever. Away from the preachy, more into the good time vibes. Alright, so let's go ahead and just dive in and see what all the fuss is about with L. Frank Baum's The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus. We begin with Santa's youth. Chapter 1. Burzee. Have you ever heard of the great forest of Burzee? Nurse used to sing of it when I was a child. She sang of the big tree trunks standing close together, with their roots intertwining below the earth and their branches intertwining above it, of their rough coating of bark and queer gnarled limbs, of the bushy foliage that roofed the entire forest, save where the sunbeams found a path through which to touch the ground in little spots, and to cast weird and curious shadows over the mosses, the lichens, and the drifts of dried leaves. The forest of Burzee is mighty and grand, and awesome to those who steal beneath its shade. Coming from the sunlit meadows into its mazes, it seems at first gloomy, then pleasant, and afterward filled with never-ending delights. For hundreds of years it has flourished in all its magnificence, the silence of its enclosure unbroken, save by the chirp of busy chipmunks, the growl of wild beasts, and the songs of birds. Yet Burzee has its inhabitants, for all this. Nature peopled it in the beginning with fairies, nooks, rills, and nymphs. As long as the forest stands, it will be a home, a refuge, and a playground to these sweet immortals who revel undisturbed in its depths. Civilization has never yet reached Burzee. Will it ever, I wonder? Yeah, you're right. This is one of the nicest parts about this time of year is, as far back as anyone can remember, wintertime has been accompanied by some sort of festivals, whether it be just post-harvest get-togethers, the warding off of the dark nights, the taking off the strictest bite of the cold, or just getting together and having nothing better to do, being reminded and enjoying each other's company. Because, you remember, a lot of these festivities came about when everything was working around the agricultural calendar. And what do farmers have to do in the winter? Wait for spring. So, there's that. Alright. Chapter 2. The Child of the Forest. Once, so long ago our great-grandfathers could scarcely have heard it mentioned, there lived within the great forest of Burzee a wood-nymph named Necile. She was closely related to the mighty Queen Zerline, and her home was beneath the shade of a wide-spreading oak. Once every year, on budding day, when the trees put forth their new buds, Necile held the golden chalice of Ak to the lips of the queen, who drank therefrom to the prosperity of the forest. So you see, she was a nymph of some importance, and, moreover, it is said she was highly regarded because of her beauty and grace. When she was created, she could not have been told, Queen Zerline could not have told, the great Ak himself could not have told. It was long ago, when the world was new, and nymphs were needed to guard the forests and to minister to the wants of the young trees. Then, on some day not remembered, Necile sprang into being, radiant, lovely, straight and slim as the sapling she was created to guard. Her hair was the color that lines a chestnut burr. Her eyes were blue in the sunlight and purple in the shade. Her cheeks bloomed with the faint pink that edges the clouds at sunset. Her lips were full red, pouting and sweet. For costume she adopted oak leaf green. All the wood nymphs dress in that color, and no other so desirable. Her dainty feet were sandal-clad, while her head remained bare of covering, other than her silken tresses. Necile's duties were few and simple. She kept hurtful weeds from growing beneath her trees, and sapping the earth food required by her charges. She frightened away the gadgols, who took evil delight... Gadgles? Who took evil delight in flying against the tree trunks and wounding them so that they drooped and died from the poisonous contact. In dry seasons, she carried water from the brooks and pools and moistened the roots of her thirsty dependents. That was in the beginning. The weeds had now learned to avoid the forest, where wood nymphs dwelt. The loathsome gadgles no longer dared come nigh. The trees had become old and sturdy, and could bear the drought, better than when fresh sprouted. So Necile's duties were lessened, and time grew laggard, while succeeding years became more tiresome and uneventful than the nymph's joyous spirit loved. Truly, the forest dwellers did not lack amusement. Each full moon they danced in the royal circle of the queen. There were also the Feast of Nuts, the Jubilee of Autumn Tintings, the solemn ceremony of leaf shedding, and the revelry of Budding Day. But these periods of enjoyment were far apart, and left many weary hours between. That a wood nymph should grow discontented was not thought of by Necile's sisters. It came upon her only after many years of brooding. But when once she had settled in her mind that life was irksome, she had no patience with her condition, and longed to do something of real interest, and to pass her days in ways hitherto undreamed of by forest nymphs. The law of the forest alone restrained her from going forth in search of adventure. While this mood lay heavy upon pretty Necile, it chanced that the great Ak visited the forest of Burzee, and allowed the wood nymphs, as was their wont, to lie at his feet and listen to the words of wisdom that fell from his lips. Ak is the master woodman of the world. He sees everything, and knows more than the sons of men. That night, he held the queen's hand, for he loved the nymphs as a father loves his children, and Necile lay at his feet with many of her sisters, and earnestly hearkened as he spoke. "We live so happily, my fair ones, in our forest glades," said Ak, stroking his grizzled beard thoughtfully, "that we know nothing of the sorrow and misery that fall to the lot of those poor mortals who inhabit the open spaces of the earth. They are not of our race, it is true, yet compassion well befits beings so fairly favored as ourselves. Often, as I pass by the dwelling of some suffering mortal, I am tempted to stop and banish the poor thing's misery. Yet suffering, in moderation, is the natural lot of mortals, and it is not our place to interfere with the laws of nature." "Nevertheless," said the fair queen, nodding her golden head at the master woodman, "it would not be a vain guess that Ak has often assisted these hapless mortals." Ak smiled. "Sometimes," he replied, "when they are very young. Children, the mortals call them. I have stopped to rescue them from misery. The men and women I dare not interfere with. They must bear the burdens nature's imposed upon them. But the helpless infants, the innocent children of men, have a right to be happy until they become full-grown and able to bear the trials of humanity. So I feel I am justified in assisting them. Not long ago, a year maybe, I found 4 children huddled in a wooden hut, slowly freezing to death. Their parents had gone to a neighboring village for food, and had left a fire to warm their little ones while they were absent. But a storm arose and drifted the snow in their path, so they were long on the road. Meantime, the fire went out, and the frost crept into the bones of the waiting children.
"Poor things," murmured the Queen softly. "What did you do?"
I called Nelko, bidding him fetch wood from my forests, and breathe upon it until the fire blazed again and warmed the little room where the children lay. Then they ceased shivering and fell asleep until their parents came.
"I am glad you did thus," said the good Queen, beaming upon the master, and Necile, who had eagerly listened to every word, echoed in a whisper, "I too am glad."
And this very night, continued Ak, as I came to the edge of Burzy, I heard a feeble cry, which I judged came from a human infant. I looked about me and found, close to the forest, a helpless babe, lying quite naked upon the grasses and wailing piteously. Not far away, screened by the forest, crouched Shiegra, the lioness, intent upon devouring the infant for her evening meal.
"And what did you do, Ak?" asked the Queen breathlessly.
Not much, being in a hurry to greet my nymphs, but I commanded Shiegra to lie close to the babe, to give it her milk to quiet its hunger, and I told her to send word throughout the forest to all beasts and reptiles that the child should not be harmed.
"I'm glad you did this," said the good Queen again, in a tone of relief. But this time, Necile did not echo her words, for the nymph, filled with a strange resolve, had suddenly stolen away from the group. Swiftly her lithe form darted through the forest paths until she reached the edge of mighty Burzy, and she paused to gaze curiously about her. Never until now had she ventured so far, for the law of the forest had placed the nymphs in its inmost depths. Necile knew she was breaking the law, but the thought did not give pause to her dainty feet. She had decided to see with her own eyes this infant Ak had told of, for she had never yet beheld a child man. All the immortals are full grown. There are no children among them. Peering through the trees, Necile saw the child lying on the grass, but now it was sweetly sleeping, having been comforted by the milk drawn from Shiegra. It was not old enough to know what peril means. If it did not feel hunger, it was content. Softly, the nymph stole to the side of the babe and knelt upon the sward, her long robe of rose-leaf color spreading about her like a gossamer cloud. Her lovely countenance expressed curiosity and surprise, but, most of all, a tender, womanly pity. The babe was newborn, chubby and pink. It was entirely helpless. While the nymph gazed, the infant opened its eyes, smiled upon her, and stretched out 2 dimpled arms. In another instant, Necile had caught it to her breast and was hurrying with it through the forest paths. That's the end of chapter 2 there. So, it is a nice little bit of world building that Baum does here. It feels like all of this is spun out of whole cloth. Just plucking bits and pieces of different sort of mythologies from thin air and deciding that, you know what, I'm going to use this here. I'm going to use this. And this is what the mythology of the world is going to be right here. And it works. Chapter 3. The Adoption. The Master Woodman suddenly arose with knitted brows. "There's a strange presence in the forest," he declared. Then the Queen and her nymphs turned and saw standing before them Necile, with the sleeping infant clasped tightly in her arms, and a defiant look in her deep blue eyes. And thus, for a moment, they remained, the nymphs filled with surprise and consternation, but the brow of the Master Woodman gradually clearing as he gazed intently upon the beautiful immortal who had willfully broken the law. Then the great Ak, to the wonder of all, laid his hand softly on Necile's flowing locks and kissed her on her fair forehead. "For the first time within my knowledge," said he, gently, "a nymph has defied me and my laws. Yet, in my heart, I can find no word of chiding. What is your desire, Necile?"
"Let me keep the child," she answered, beginning to tremble and falling on her knees in supplication.
"Here, in the forest of Burzee, where the human race has never yet penetrated?" questioned Ak.
"Here, in the forest of Burzee," replied the nymph boldly. "It is my home, and I am weary for lack of occupation. Let me care for the babe. See how weak and helpless it is. Surely it cannot harm Burzee, nor the Master Woodman of the world."
"But the law, child, the law!" cried Ak sternly.
"The law is made by the Master Woodsman," returned Necile. "If he bids me care for the babe he himself has saved from death, who in all the world dare oppose me?"
Queen Zerline, who had listened intently to this conversation, clapped her pretty hands gleefully at the nymph's answer.
"You are fairly trapped, O Ak," she exclaimed, laughing. "Now, I pray you, give heed to Necile's petition."
The woodsman, as was his habit when in thought, stroked his grizzled beard slowly. Then he said, "She shall keep the babe, and I will give it my protection. But I warn you, all that as this is the first time I have relaxed the law, so shall it be the last time. Nevermore, to the end of the world, shall a mortal be adopted by an immortal. Otherwise, would we abandon our happy existence for one of trouble and anxiety. Good night, my nymphs." Then Ak was gone from their midst, and Necile hurried away to her bower to rejoice over her new-found treasure.
All right, so far we have a pretty standard baby abandoned, adopted by forest critters story. The setting is familiar and comfortable. The cast and crew that are assembled are a little different from what we may be accustomed to, but this is a very familiar rhythm for the story to run through. It's got well-worn grooves. It's a comfortable road. So let's see how it continues on. Chapter 4. Claus. Claus or Claus? I kind of think when he's young, Claus is fine. Another day found Necile's bower, the most popular place in the forest. The nymphs clustered around her and the child that lay asleep in her lap, with expressions of curiosity and delight. Nor were they wanting in praises for the great Ak's kindness in allowing Necile to keep the babe and to care for it. Even the queen came to peer into the innocent childish face and to hold a helpless, chubby fist in her own fair hand. "What shall we call him, Necile?" she asked, smiling. "He must have a name, you know." "Let him be called Claus," answered Necile, "for it means a little one." "Rather, let him be called Neclaus," returned the queen, "for that will mean Necile's little one." The nymphs clapped their hands in delight, and Neclaus became the infant's name. Although
Necile loved best to call him Claus. And after days, many of her sisters followed her example. Necile gathered the softest moss in all the forest for Claus to lie upon, and she made his bed in her own bower. Of food the infant had no lack. The nymphs searched the forest for bell udders which grow upon the goa tree, and when opened are found to be filled with sweet milk, and the soft-eyed does willingly gave a share of their milk to support the stranger, while Shiegra, the lioness, often crept stealthily into Necile's bower and purred softly as she lay beside the babe and fed it. So the little one flourished, and grew big and sturdy day by day, while Necile taught him to speak and to walk and to play. His thoughts and words were sweet and gentle, for the nymphs knew no evil, and their hearts were pure and loving. He became the pet of the forest, for Act's decree had forbidden beast or reptile to molest him, and he walked fearlessly wherever his will guided him. Presently, the news reached the other immortals that the nymphs of BGM had adopted a human infant, and that the act had been sanctioned by the great Act. Therefore, many of them came to visit the little stranger, looking upon him with much interest. First the rills, who are first cousins to the wood nymphs, although so differently formed, for the rills are required to watch over the flowers and plants, as the nymphs watch over the forest trees. They search the wide world for the food required by the roots of the flowering plants, while the brilliant colors possessed by the full-blown flowers are due to the dyes placed in the soil by the rills, which are drawn through the little veins in the roots and the body of the plants as they reach maturity. The rills are a busy people, for their flowers bloom and fade continually, but they are merry and light-hearted, and are very popular with the other immortals. Next came the Knooks, whose duty it was to watch over the beasts of the world, both gentle and wild. The Knooks have a hard time of it, since many of the beasts are ungovernable, and rebel against restraint. But they know how to manage them, after all, and you will find that certain laws of the Knooks are obeyed even by the most ferocious animals. Their anxieties make the Knooks look old and worn and crooked, but their natures are a bit rough from associating with wild creatures continually. Yet, they are most useful to humanity, and to the world in general, as their laws are the only laws the forest beasts recognize, except those of the Master Woodsman. Then there were the fairies, the guardians of mankind, who were much interested in the adoption of Claus, because their own laws forbade them to become familiar with their human charges. There are instances on record where the fairies have shown themselves to human beings, and even have conversed with them, but they are supposed to guard the lives of humankind, unseen and unknown. And if they favor some people more than others, it is because these have won such distinction fairly, as the fairies are very just and impartial. But the idea of adopting a child of men had never occurred to them, because it was in every way opposed to their laws. So their curiosity was intense to behold the little stranger adopted by Necile and her sister nymphs. Claus looked upon the immortals, who thronged around him with fearless eyes and smiling lips. He rode laughingly upon the shoulders of the merry rills. He mischievously pulled the grey beards of the low-browed Knooks. He rested his curly head confidently upon the dainty bosom of the fairy queen herself. And the rills loved the sound of his laughter. The Knooks loved his courage. The fairies loved his innocence. The boy made friends of them all, and learned to know their laws intimately. No forest flower was trampled beneath his feet, lest the friendly rills should be grieved. He never interfered with the beasts of the forest, lest his friends the Knooks should become angry. The fairies he loved dearly, but knowing nothing of mankind, he could not understand that he was the only one of his race admitted to friendly intercourse with them. Indeed, Claus came to understand that he alone, of all the forest people, had no like nor fellow. To him, the forest was the world. He had no idea that millions of toiling, striving human creatures existed, and he was happy and content. And here we have a bit of a footnote by the author.
Some people have spelled the name Niklaus, and others Nicholas, which is the reason that Santa Claus is still known in some lands as St. Nicholas. But of course, Niklaus is his right name, and Claus, the nickname given him by his adopted mother, the fair nymph Necile. Thank you for explaining that, Baum. Never would have guessed. This is a children's book, remember? All right. So, Chapter 5, The Master Woodsman. Years pass swiftly in Burzee, for the nymphs have no need to regard time in any way. Even centuries make no change in the dainty creatures. Ever and ever they remain the same, immortal and unchanging. Claus, however, being mortal, grew to manhood day by day. Necile was disturbed, presently, to find him too big to lie in her lap. And he had a desire for food other than milk. His stout legs carried him far into Burzee's heart, where he gathered supplies of nuts and berries, as well as several sweet and wholesome roots, which suited his stomach better than bell udders. He sought Necile's bower less frequently, till finally it became his custom to return thither only to sleep. The nymph, who had come to love him dearly, was puzzled to comprehend the changed nature of her charge, and unconsciously altered her own mode of life to conform to his whims. She followed him readily through the forest paths, as did many of her sister nymphs, explaining as they walked all the mysteries of the gigantic wood and the habits and nature of the living things which dwelt beneath its shade. The language of the beasts became clear to little Claus, but he never could understand their sulky and morose tempers. Only the squirrels, the mice, and the rabbits seemed to possess cheerful and merry natures. Yet would the boy laugh when the panther growled, and stroke the bear's glossy coat, while the creature snarled and bared its teeth menacingly. The growls and snarls were not for Claus, he well knew, so what did they matter? He could sing the songs of the bees, recite the poetry of the woodflowers, and relate the history of every blinking owl in Burzee. He helped the rills to feed their plants, and the knooks to keep order among the animals. The little immortals regarded him as a privileged person, being especially protected by Queen Zerline and her nymphs, and favored by the great Ak himself. One day, the Master Woodsman came back to the forest of Burzee. He had visited, in turn, all his forests throughout the world, and they were many and broad. Not until he entered the glade, where the Queen and her nymphs were assembled to greet him, did Ak remember the child he had permitted Necile to adopt. Then he found, sitting familiarly in the circle of lovely immortals, a broad-shouldered, stalwart youth, who, when erect, stood fully high as the shoulder of the master himself. Ak paused, silent and frowning, to bend his piercing gaze upon Claus. The clear eyes met his own steadfastly, and the woodsman gave a sigh of relief as he marked their placid depths and read the youth's brave and innocent heart. Nevertheless, as Ak sat beside the fair queen, and the golden chalice filled with rare nectar passed from lip to lip, the Master Woodsman was strangely silent and reserved, and stroked his beard many times with a thoughtful motion. When, with morning, he called Claus aside, in kindly fashion, saying, "Bid goodbye, for a time, to Necile and her sisters, for you shall accompany me on my journey through the world." The venture pleased Claus. He knew well the honor of being companion of the Master Woodsman of the world, but Necile wept for the first time in her life, and clung to the boy's neck as if she could not bear to let him go. The nymph who had mothered this sturdy youth was still as dainty, as charming and beautiful as when she had dared to face Ak, with the babe clasped to her breast. Nor was her love less great. Ak beheld the two clinging together, seemingly as brother and sister to one another, and again he wore his thoughtful look. That's the end of Chapter 5. yeah, it's charming in its own way. It's, as I mentioned earlier, it follows very familiar rails of the story, but that doesn't take anything away from it. There's something nice about so far it's a feel-good story. It's mystical forest creatures have adopted an orphan, and he grows and doesn't betray their expectations. He's every bit as pure and good inside as they are, a reflection of his upbringing, which so many times this sort of story turns into sort of a reflection of Adam and Eve being cast out of Eden, and we know how that went. So it's nice to see how things retain their innocence. Alright, Chapter 6. Claus discovers humanity. Taking Claus to a small clearing in the forest, the master said, "Place your hand upon my girdle, and hold fast while we journey through the air. For now shall we encircle the world, and look upon many of the haunts of those men from whom you are descended." These words caused Claus to marvel, for until now he had thought himself the only one of his kind upon the earth. Yet in silence he grasped firmly the girdle of the great hack, his astonishment forbidding speech. Yeah, the idea of Santa as being raised by the mystical creatures of the wood it's kind of fun. It adds to the mystique, the charm, and the mystery of how Santa is so much more than a regular man. Then the vast forest of Bluesky seemed to fall away from their feet, and the youth found himself passing swiftly through the air at a great height. Ere long there were spires beneath them, while buildings of many shapes and colors met their downward view. It was a city of men, and Ak, pausing to descend, led Claus to its enclosure. Said the master, "So long as you hold fast to my girdle, you will remain unseen by all mankind, though seeing clearly yourself. To release your grasp will be to separate yourself forever from me and your home in Bluesky." One of the first laws of the forest is obedience, and Claus had no thought of disobeying the master's wish. He clung fast to the girdle and remained invisible. Thereafter, with each moment passed in the city, the youth's wonder grew. He, who had supposed himself created differently from all others, now found the earth swarming with creatures of his own kind. "Indeed," said Ak, "the immortals are few, but the mortals are many." Claus looked earnestly upon his fellows. There were sad faces, gay and reckless faces, pleasant faces, anxious faces, and kindly faces, all mingled in puzzling disorder. Some worked at tedious tasks. Some strutted in impudent conceit. Some were thoughtful and grave, while others seemed happy and content. Men of many natures were there, as everywhere, and Claus found much to please him and much to make him sad. But especially, he noted the children. First curiously, then eagerly, then lovingly. Ragged little ones rolled in the dusts of the street, playing with scraps and pebbles. Other children, gaily dressed, were propped upon cushions and fed with sugar plums. Yet the children of the rich were not happier than those playing with the dust and pebbles, it seemed to Claus. "Childhood is the time of man's greatest content," said Ak, following the youth's thought. "'Tis during these years of innocent pleasure that the little ones are most free from care." "Tell me," said Claus, "why do not all these babies fare alike?" "Because they are born in both cottage and palace," returned the master. "The difference in wealth of the patient parents determines the lot of the child. Some are carefully tended and clothed in silks and dainty linen. Others are neglected and covered with rags."
Yet all seem equally fair and sweet, said Claus thoughtfully. While they are babes, yes, agreed Ak. Their joy is in being alive, and they do not stop to think. In after years the doom of mankind overtakes them, and they find they must struggle and worry, work and fret to gain the wealth that is so dear to the hearts of men. Such things are unknown in the forest where you were reared. Claus was silent for a moment. Then he asked, Why was I reared in the forest, among those who are not of my race? Then Ak, in a gentle voice, told him the story of his babyhood, how he had been abandoned at the forest's edge and left a prey to wild beasts, and how the loving nymph Necile had rescued him and brought him to manhood under the protection of the immortals. Yet I am not of them, said Claus musingly. You are not of them, returned the woodsman. The nymph who cared for you as a mother seems now like a sister to you. By and by, when you grow old and gray, she will seem like a daughter. Yet another brief span, and you will be but a memory, while she remains Necile. Then why, if a man must perish, is he born? Demanded the boy. Everything perishes except the world itself and its keepers, answered Ak. But while life lasts, everything on earth has its use. The wise seek ways to be helpful to the world, for the helpful ones are sure to live again. Much of this Claus failed to understand fully, but a longing seized him to become helpful to his fellows, and he remained grave and thoughtful while they resumed their journey. They visited many dwellings of men in many parts of the world, watching farmers toil in the fields, warriors dash into cruel fray, and merchants exchange their goods for bits of white and yellow metal. Everywhere, the eyes of Claus sought out the children in love and pity, for the thought of his own helpless babyhood was strong within him, and he yearned to give help to the innocent little ones of his race, even as he had been succored by the kindly nymph. Day by day, the master woodsman and his pupil traversed the earth, Ak speaking but seldom to the youth, who clung steadfastly to his girdle, but guiding him into all places where he might become familiar with the lives of human beings. And, at last, they returned to the grand old forest of Bluesky, where the master set Claus down within the circle of nymphs, among whom the pretty Necile anxiously awaited him. The brow of the great Ak was now calm and peaceful, but the brow of Claus had become lined with deep thought. Necile sighed at the change in her foster son, who until now had been ever joyous and smiling, and the thought came to her that never again would the life of the boy be the same as before this eventful journey with the master. That is the end of chapter 6, wherein Ak had to remind us all that getting older is the start of the end, the doom of mankind. Thanks, Ak. Just what I needed reminding of. Thank you. Alright, so let's continue on with chapter 7. Yeah, feel it in the knees, feel it in the back. Chapter 7. Claus leaves the forest. When good Queen Zerline had touched the golden chalice with her fair lips, and it had passed around the circle in honor of the traveler's return, the master woodsman of the world, who had not yet spoken, turned his gaze frankly upon Claus and said, "Well?" The boy understood, and rose slowly to his feet beside Necile. Once only his eyes passed around the familiar circle of nymphs, every one of whom he remembered as a loving comrade, but tears came unbidden to dim his sight. So he gazed thereafter steadfastly at the master. I have been ignorant, said he, simply, until the great Ak in his kindness taught me who and what I am. You, who live so sweetly in your forest bowers, ever fair and youthful and innocent, no fit comrades for a son of humanity. For I have looked upon man, finding him doomed to live for a brief space upon earth, to toil for the things he needs, to fade into old age, and then to pass away, as the leaves in autumn. Yet every man has his mission, which is to leave the world better, in some way than he found it. I am of the race of men, and man's lot is my lot. For your tender care of the poor, forsaken babe you adopted, as well as for your loving comradeship during my boyhood, my heart will ever overflow with gratitude, my foster mother. Here he stopped and kissed Nasile's white forehead. I shall love and cherish while life lasts. But I must leave you, to take my part in the endless struggle to which humanity is doomed, and to live my life in my own way. What will you do? Asked the queen gravely. I must devote myself to the care of the children of mankind, and try to make them happy, he answered. Since your own tender care of a babe brought to me happiness and strength, it is just and right that I devote my life to the pleasure of other babes. Thus will the memory of the loving nymph Nasile be planted within the hearts of thousands of my race for many years to come, and her kindly act be recounted in song and in story while the world shall last. Have I spoken well, O master?
You have spoken well, returned Ak. Rising to his feet, he continued, Yet one thing must not be forgotten. Having been adopted as the child of the forest and the playfellow of the nymphs, you have gained a distinction which forever separates you from your kind. Therefore, when you go forth into the world of men, you shall retain the protection of the forest, and the powers you now enjoy will remain with you to assist you in your labors. In any need you may call upon the nymphs, the rills, the nooks, and the fairies, and they will serve you gladly. I, the master woodman of the world, have said it, and my word is the law.
Claus looked upon Ak with grateful eyes. This will make me mighty among men, he replied. Protected by these kind friends, I may be able to make thousands of little children happy. I will try very hard to do my duty, and I know the forest people will give me their sympathy and help. We will, said the Queen Fairy earnestly. We will, cried the merry rills, laughing. We will, shouted the crooked nooks, scowling. We will, exclaimed the sweet nymphs proudly. But Nasile said nothing. She only folded Claus in her arms and kissed him tenderly. The world is big, continued the boy, turning again to his loyal friends, but men are everywhere. I shall begin my work near my friends, so that if I meet with misfortune, I can come to the forest for counsel or help. With that, he gave them all a loving look and turned away. There was no need to say goodbye, but for him, the sweet, wild life of the forest was over. He went forth bravely to meet his doom, the doom of the race of man, the necessity to worry and work. But Ak, who knew the boy's heart, was merciful and guided his steps. Coming through Burzee to its eastern edge, Claus reached the laughing valley of Hohaho. On each side were rolling green hills, and a brook wandered midway between them to a wind afar off beyond the valley. At his back was the grim forest. At the far end of the valley, a broad plain. The eyes of the young man, which had until now reflected his grave thoughts, became brighter as he stood silent, looking out upon the laughing valley. Then, on a sudden, his eyes twinkled, as stars do on a still night, and grew merry and wide. For at his feet, the cowslips and daisies smiled at him in friendly regard. The breeze whistled gaily as it passed by and fluttered the locks on his forehead. The brook laughed joyously as it leaped over the pebbles and swept around the green curves of its banks. The bees sang sweet songs as they flew from dandelion to daffodil. The beetles chirruped happily in the long grass, and the sunbeams glinted pleasantly over all the scene. "Here," cried Claus, stretching out his arms as if to embrace the valley, "will I make my home." That was many, many years ago. It has been his home ever since. It is his home now. And that's the end of part 1, where we see Santa Claus's boyhood, or youth. So we're a little bit early for our break, but this is where we'll take a short break before we continue. But let's reflect a little bit. So it seems a lot's happened already. Little Claus was found by the nymphs. We saw the introduction of and the world building of Ak, the master woodsman, and all his creatures, the nymphs, the rills, the nooks, etc., the fairies. And it paints a pretty picture. We see the innocence and purity of the forest. We see the forgiveness that Ak can have for Nasil, who disobeyed his laws, but for a good reason. We saw Santa, or Claus, growing up to be a good man despite his ignorance. And then, after being confronted by his ignorance, deciding that he can do his part to try and leave the world better than he found it. Which really is what everyone should strive for, is if you leave the world better than you found it, you had a good life. That's generally what we all hope for anyway, right? So, this is so far, it's a good story that has morals, but isn't preachy and isn't moralistic. And yes, he does like his multiple groups of very slightly different small people. He's a man of strict principles. His fantastical creatures should be about waist high. Except for the important ones. Alright, let's go ahead and take a few minutes, stretch our legs, top up our drinks, and we'll be back in just a little while to continue this story as we read through and are introduced to Santa Claus's manhood in the most innocent of terms. Not to be confused with anything even remotely inappropriate. Alright, be back in just a little bit.
Alright, we are back. Alright, so we saw Santa's youth, and now we need to see how he will comport himself as an adult, as he goes through life without the comfort of his adopted family. They may be nearby, they may be available for his assistance if necessary, but he's standing on his own two legs now, and going out into the world to try and bring some comfort to the children that he finds, those that are unable to help themselves. So, let's continue on with part 2 of The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus. Chapter 1, The Laughing Valley. When Claus came, the valley was empty, save for the grass, the brook, the wildflowers, the bees, and the butterflies. If he would make his home here and live after the fashion of men, he must have a house. This puzzled him at first, but while he stood smiling in the sunshine, he suddenly found beside him old Nelko, the servant of the master woodsman. Nelko bore an axe, strong and broad, with blade that gleamed like burnished silver. This he placed in the young man's hand, then disappeared without a word. Claus understood, and, turning to the forest's edge, he selected a number of fallen tree trunks, which he began to clear of their dead branches. He would not cut into a living tree. His life among the nymphs who guarded the forest had taught him that a live tree is sacred, being a created thing endowed with feeling. But with the dead and fallen trees, it was different. They had fulfilled their destiny as active members of the forest community, and now it was fitting that their remains should minister to the needs of man. The axe bit deep into the logs at every stroke. It seemed to have a force of its own, and Claus had but to swing and guide it. When shadows began creeping over the green hills to lie in the valley overnight, the young man had chopped many logs into equal lengths and proper shapes for building a house such as he had seen the poorer classes of men inhabit. Then, revolving to await another day before he tried to fit the logs together, Claus ate some of the sweet roots he knew well how to find, drank deeply from the laughing brook, and lay down to sleep on the grass. First seeking a spot where no flowers grew, lest the weight of his body should crush them. And while he slumbered and breathed in the perfume of the wondrous valley of the spirit of happiness crept into his heart, and drove out all terror and care and misgivings. Never more would the face of Claus be clouded with anxieties. Never more would the trials of life weigh him down as with a burden. The Laughing Valley had claimed him for its own. Would that we all might live in that delightful place. But then, maybe it would become overcrowded. For ages it has awaited a tenant. Was it chance that led young Claus to make his home in this happy vale? Or may we guess that his thoughtful friends, the Immortals, had directed his steps when he wandered away from Burzee to seek a home in the great world? Certain it is that while the moon peered over the hilltop and flooded with its soft beams the body of the sleeping stranger, the Laughing Valley was filled with the queer, crooked shapes of the friendly Knooks. These people spoke no words, but worked with skill and swiftness. The logs Claus had trimmed with his bright axe were carried to a spot beside the brook, and fitted one upon another. And during the night a strong and roomy dwelling was built. The birds came sweeping into the valley at daybreak, and their songs, so seldom heard in the deep wood, aroused the stranger. He rubbed the web of sleep from his eyelids and looked around. The house met his gaze. "I must thank the Knooks for this," said he, gratefully. Then he walked to his dwelling and entered at the doorway. A large room faced him, having a fireplace at the end and a table and a bench in the middle. Beside the fireplace was a cupboard. Another doorway was beyond. Claus entered here, also, and saw a smaller room, with a bed against the wall, and a stool set near a small stand.
On the bed were many layers of dried moss brought from the forest.
Indeed, it is a palace! Exclaimed the smiling Claus.
I must thank the good Knooks again, for their knowledge of man's needs as well as for their labors in my behalf. He left his new home with a glad feeling that he was not quite alone in the world, although he had chosen to abandon his forest life. Friendships are not easily broken, and immortals are everywhere. Upon reaching the brook, he drank of the pure water, and then sat down on the bank to laugh at the mischievous gambols of the ripples as they pushed one another against rocks or crowded desperately to see which should first reach the turn beyond. And as they raced away, he listened to the song they sang. Rushing, pushing, on we go, not a wave may gently flow, all are too excited, every drop delighted, turns to spray and merry play as we tumble on our way. Next, Claus searched for roots to eat, while the daffodils turned their little eyes up to him laughingly and lisped their dainty song. Blooming fairly, never growing rarely, never flowerets were so gay, perfume breathing, joy bequeathing as our colors we display. It made Claus laugh to hear the little things voice their happiness as they nodded gracefully on their stems. But another strain caught his ear as the sunbeams fell gently across his face and whispered, "Here is gladness, that our rays warm the valley through the days. Here is happiness to give, comfort unto all who live."
"Yes," cried Claus in answer, "there is happiness and joy in all things here. The Laughing Valley is a valley of peace and goodwill."
He passed the day talking with the ants and beetles, and exchanging jokes with the light-hearted butterflies, and at night he lay on his bed of soft moss and slept soundly. Then came the fairies, merry but noiseless, bringing skillets and pots and dishes and pans and all the tools necessary to prepare food and to comfort a mortal. With these they filled cupboard and fireplace, finally placing a stout suit of wool clothing on the stool beside the bedside. When Claus awoke, he rubbed his eyes again and laughed, and spoke aloud his thanks to the fairies and the master woodsman who had sent them. With eager joy he examined all his new possessions, wondering what some might be used for. But in the days when he had clung to the girdle of the great axe and visited the cities of men, his eyes had been quick to note all the manners and customs of the race to which he belonged. So he guessed from the gifts brought by the fairies and that the master expected him hereafter to live in the fashion of his fellow creatures. Which means that I must plow the earth and plant corn, he reflected, so that when winter comes, I shall have garnered food in plenty. But as he stood in the grassy valley, he saw that to turn up the earth in furrows would be to destroy hundreds of pretty helpless flowers, as well as thousands of the tender blades of grass, and this he could not bear to do. Therefore he stretched out his arms and uttered a peculiar whistle he had learned in the forest, afterward crying, "Rills of the field flowers, come to me!" Instantly a dozen of the queer little rills were squatting upon the ground before him, and they nodded to him in cheerful greeting. Claus gazed upon them earnestly. "Your brothers of the forest," he said, "I have known and loved many years. I shall love you also when we have become friends. To me, the law of the rills, whether those of the forest or the field, are sacred. I have never willfully destroyed one of the flowers you tend so carefully, but I must plant grain to use for food during the cold winter, and how am I to do this without killing the little creatures that sing to me so prettily of their fragrant blossoms?" The yellow rill, he who tends the buttercups, made answer, "Fret not, friend Claus. The great axe has spoken to us of you. There is better work for you in life than to labor for food, and though, not being of the forest, Ack has no command over us, nevertheless are we glad to favor one he loves. Live, therefore, to do the good work you are resolved to undertake. We, the field rills, will attend to your food supplies." After this speech, the rills were no longer to be seen, and Claus drove from his mind the thought of tilling the earth. When next he wandered back to his dwelling, a bowl of fresh milk stood upon the table, Bread was in the cupboard, and sweet honey filled a dish beside it. A pretty basket of rosy apples and new-plucked grapes was also awaiting him. He called out, "Thanks, my friends," to the invisible rills, and straightway began to eat of the food. Thereafter, when hungry, he had but to look into the cupboard, and find goodly supplies brought by the kindly rills, and the nooks cut and stacked much wood for his fireplace, and the fairies brought him warm blankets and clothing. So began his life in the Laughing Valley, with the favor and friendship of the immortals to minister to his every want. It would be nice to just have everything taken care of. Just open the cupboard and there you go. Need clothes? Oh, they're in the closet. Oh, okay, we're good. Yeah. Chapter 2. How Claus made the first toy. Wait, like the first one ever? I see. Truly our Claus had wisdom, for his good fortune but strengthened his resolve to befriend the little ones of his own race. He knew his plan was approved by the immortals, else they would not have favored him so greatly. So he began at once to make acquaintance with mankind. You know what? Making pierogies? Is that really work, though? That's joy. Just joy waiting to happen. So he began at once to make acquaintance with mankind. He walked through the valley to the plain beyond, and crossed the plain in many directions to reach the abodes of men. These stood singly or in groups of dwellings called villages, and in nearly all the houses, whether big or little, Claus found children. The youngsters came to know with his merry, laughing face and the kind glance of his bright eyes, and the parents, while they regarded the young man with some scorn for loving children more than their elders, were content that the girls and boys found a playfellow who seemed willing to amuse them. So the children romped and played games with Claus. That's fair, that's fair. It's a joy deferred. You're banking away joy for some hours later. The youngsters soon came to know his merry laugh. Oh, no, we rolled back a paragraph. So the children romped and played games with Claus, and the boys rode upon his shoulders, and the girls nestled in his strong arms, and the babies clung fondly to his knees. Wherever the young man chanced to be, the sound of childish laughter followed him. And to understand this better, you must know that children were much neglected in those days, and received little attention from their parents, so that it became to them a marvel that so goodly a man as Claus devoted his time in making them happy. And those who knew him were, you may be sure, very happy indeed. The sad faces of the poor and abused grew bright for once. The cripples smiled despite his misfortune. The ailing ones hushed their moans, and the grieved ones their cries, when their merry friend came nigh to comfort them. Only at the beautiful palace of the Lord of Lurd at the frowning castle of the Baron Braun was Claus refused admittance. There were children at both places, but the servants at the palace shut the door in the young stranger's face, and the fierce Baron threatened to hang him from an iron hook on the castle walls. Whereupon Claus sighed and went back to the poorer dwellings, where he was welcome. After a time, the winter drew near. The flowers lived out their lives and faded and disappeared. The beetles burrowed far into the warm earth. The butterflies deserted the meadows, and the voice of the brook grew hoarse, as if it had taken cold. One day, snowflakes filled all the air in the Laughing Valley, dancing boisterously toward the earth and clothing in pure white raiment the roof of Claus's dwelling. At night, Jack Frost rapped at the door. "Come in!" cried Claus. "Come out!" answered Jack, "for you have a fire inside." So Claus came out. He had known Jack Frost in the forest, and liked the jolly rogue, even while he mistrusted him. "There will be a rare sport for me tonight, Claus," shouted the sprite. "Isn't it glorious weather?
I shall nip scores of noses and ears and toes before daybreak." "If you love me, Jack, spare the children," begged Claus. "And why?" asked the other in surprise. "They are tender and helpless," answered Claus. "But I love to nip the tender ones," declared Jack. "The older ones are tough and tire my fingers." "The young ones are weak and cannot fight you," said Claus. "True," agreed Jack thoughtfully. "Well, I will not pinch a child this night, if I can resist the temptation," he promised. "Good night, Claus." "Good night." The young man went in and closed the door, and Jack Frost ran on to the nearest village. Claus threw a log on the fire, which burned up brightly. Beside the hearth sat Blinky, a big cat given him by Peter the Knook. Her fur was soft and glossy, and she purred never-ending songs of contentment. "I shall not see the children again soon," said Claus to the cat, who kindly paused in her song to listen. "The winter is upon us. The snow will be deep for many days, and I shall be unable to play with my little friends." The cat raised a paw and stroked her nose thoughtfully, but made no reply. So long as the fire burned and Claus sat in his easy chair by the hearth, she did not mind the weather. So passed many days and many long evenings. The cupboard was always full, but Claus became wary with having nothing to do more than to feed the fire from the big woodpile the Knooks had brought him. One evening, he picked up a stick of wood and began to cut it with his sharp knife. He had no thought at first except to occupy his time, and he whistled and sang to the cat as he carved away portions of the stick. Puss sat up on her haunches and watched him, listening at the same time to her master's merry whistle, which she loved to hear even more than her own purring songs. Claus glanced at Puss, and then at the stick he was whittling, until presently the wood began to have a shape, and the shape was like the head of a cat, with 2 ears sticking upward. Claus stopped whistling to laugh, and then both he and the cat looked at the wooden image in some surprise. Then he carved out the eyes and the nose, and rounded the lower part of the head so that it rested upon a neck. Puss hardly knew what to make of it now, and sat up stiffly, as if watching with some suspicion what would come next. Claus knew. The head gave him an idea. He plied his knife carefully and with skill, forming slowly the body of the cat, which he made to sit upon its haunches as the real cat did, with her tail wound around her 2 front legs. The work cost him much time, but the evening was long, and he had nothing better to do. Finally, he gave a loud and delighted laugh at the result of his labors, and placed the wooden cat, now completed, upon the hearth opposite the real one. Puss thereupon glared at her image, raised her hair in anger, and uttered a defiant mew. The wooden cat paid no attention, and Claus, much amused, laughed again. Then Blinky advanced toward the wooden image to eye it closely and smell it intelligently. Eyes and nose told her the creature was wood, in spite of its natural appearance. So Puss resumed her seat and her purring, but as she neatly washed her face with her padded paw, she cast more than one admiring glance at her clever master. Perhaps she felt the same satisfaction we feel when we look upon good photographs of ourselves. The cat's master was himself pleased with his handiwork, without knowing exactly why. Indeed, he had great cause to congratulate himself that night, and all the children throughout the world should have joined him in rejoicing, for Claus had made his first toy. The idea of Santa having a cat just fits right. I'm okay with this. This is an acceptable depiction. All right. Chapter 3. How the Rills Colored the Toys. A hush lay on the Laughing Valley now. Snow covered it, like a white spread, and pillows of downy flakes drifted before the dwelling where Claus sat feeding the blaze of the fire. The brook gurgled on beneath a heavy sheet of ice, and all living plants and insects nestled close to Mother Earth to keep warm.
The face of the moon was hid by dark clouds, and the wind, delighting in the wintry sport, pushed and whirled the snowflakes in so many directions that they could get no chance to fall to the ground. Claus heard the wind whistling and shrieking in its play, and thanked the good Knooks again for his comfortable shelter. Blinky washed her face lazily and stared at the coals with a look of perfect content. The toy cat sat opposite the real one and gazed straight ahead, as toy cats should. Suddenly, Claus heard a noise that sounded different from the voice of the wind. It was more like a wail of suffering and despair. He stood up and listened, but the wind was growing boisterous, shook the door and rattled the windows to distract his attention. He waited until the wind was tired, and then, still listening, he heard once more the shrill cry of distress. Quickly he drew on his coat, pulled his cap over his eyes, and opened the door. The wind dashed in and scattered the embers over the hearth, at the same time blowing Blinky's fur so furiously that she crept under the table to escape. Then the door was closed and Claus was outside, peering anxiously into the darkness. The wind laughed and scolded and tried to push him over, but he stood firm. The helpless flakes stumbled against his eyes and dimmed his sight, but he rubbed them away and looked again. Snow was everywhere, white and glistening and glittering. It covered the earth and filled the air. The cry was not repeated. Claus turned to go back into the house, but the wind caught him unawares, and he stumbled and fell across a snowdrift. His hand plunged into the drift and touched something that was not snow. This he seized and, pulling it gently toward him, found it to be a child. The next moment he had lifted it in his arms and carried it into the house. The wind followed him through the door, but Claus shut it out quickly. He laid the rescued child on the hearth, and brushing away the snow, he discovered it to be Weekum, a little boy who lived in a house beyond the valley. Claus wrapped a warm blanket around the little one and rubbed the frost from its limbs. Before long, the child opened his eyes and, seeing where he was, smiled happily. Then Claus warmed milk and fed it to the boy slowly, while the cat looked on with sober curiosity. Finally, the little one curled up in his friend's arms and sighed and fell asleep, and Claus, filled with gladness that he had found the wanderer, held him closely while he slumbered. The wind, finding no more mischief to do, climbed the hill and swept on toward the north. This gave the wary snowflakes time to settle down to earth, and the valley became still again. The boy, having slept well in the arms of his friend, opened his eyes and sat up. Then, as a child will, he looked around the room and saw all that it contained. "Your cat is a nice cat, Claus," he said at last. "Let me hold it." But Puss objected and ran away. "The other cat won't run, Claus," continued the boy. "Let me hold that one." Claus placed the toy in his arms, and the boy held it lovingly and kissed the tip of its wooden ear. "How did you get lost in the storm, Weekum?" asked Claus. "I started to walk to my auntie's house and lost my way," answered Weekum. "Were you frightened?" "It was cold," said Weekum, "and the snow got in my eyes so I could not see. Then I kept on till I fell in the snow without knowing where I was. And the wind blew the flakes over me and covered me up." Claus gently stroked his head, and the boy looked up at him and smiled. "I'm all right now," said Weekum. "Yes," replied Claus happily. "Now I will put you in my warm bed, and you must sleep until morning, when I will carry you back to your mother." "May the cat sleep with me?" asked the boy. "Yes, if you wish it to," answered Claus. "It's a nice cat," Weekum said, smiling, as Claus tucked the blankets around him, and presently the little one fell asleep with the wooden toy in his arms. When morning came, the sun claimed the Laughing Valley and flooded it with his rays. So Claus prepared to take the lost child back to its mother. "May I keep the cat, Claus?" asked Weekum. "It's nicer than real cats. It doesn't run away or scratch or bite. May I keep it?" "Yes, indeed," answered Claus, pleased that the toy that he had made could give pleasure to the child. So he wrapped the boy and the wooden cat in a warm cloak, perching the bundle upon his broad shoulders, and then he tramped through the snow and the drifts of the valley, and across the plain beyond the poor cottage where Weekham's mother lived.
"See, Mama!"
cried the boy as soon as they entered.
"I've got a cat!"
The good woman wept tears of joy over the rescue of her darling, and thanked Claus many times for his kind act. So he carried a warm and happy heart back to his home in the valley. That night he said to Puss, "I believe the children will love the wooden cats almost as well as the real ones, and they can't hurt them by pulling their tails and ears. I'll make another." So this was the beginning of his great work. The next cat was made better than the first. While Claus sat whittling it out, the yellow rill came in to make him a visit, and so pleased was he with the man's skill that he ran away and brought several of his fellows. There sat the red rill, the black rill, the green rill, the blue rill, and the yellow rill in a circle on the floor, while Claus whittled, and the wooden cat grew into shape.
"If it could be made the same color as the real cat, no one would tell the difference," said the yellow rill thoughtfully.
"The little ones, maybe, would not know the difference," replied Claus, pleased with the idea.
"I will bring you some of the red that I color my roses and tulips with," cried the red rill, "and then you can make the cat's lips and tongue red." "I will bring some of the green that I color my grasses and leaves with," said the green rill, "and then you can color the cat's eyes green." "Then I will need a bit of yellow also," remarked the yellow rill. "I must fetch some of the yellow that I used to color my buttercups and goldenrods with."
"The real cat is black," said the black rill. "I will bring some of the black that I used to color the eyes of my pansies with, and then you can paint your wooden cat black."
"I see you have a blue ribbon around Blinky's neck," added the blue rill. "I will get some of that color I used to paint the bluebells and forget-me-nots with, and then you can carve a wooden ribbon on the toy cat's neck and paint it blue."
So the rills disappeared. By the time Claus had finished carving out the form of the cat, they were all back with paints and brushes. They made Blinky sit upon the table, that Claus might paint the toy cat just the right color. And when the work was done, the rills declared it was exactly as good as a live cat.
"That is, to all appearances,"
added the red rill. Blinky seemed a little offended by the attention bestowed upon the toy, and that she might not seem to approve the imitation cat, she walked to the corner of the hearth and sat down with a dignified air. Yeah, Blinky's got all of the attitude that a void should have. Voids are the sassiest of cats. But Claus was delighted, and as soon as morning came, he started out and tramped through the snow, across the valley and the plain, until he came to a village. There, in a poor hut near the walls of the beautiful palace of the Lord of Lurd, a little girl lay upon a wretched cot, moaning with pain. Claus approached the child and kissed her and comforted her, and then he drew the toy cat from beneath his coat, where he had hidden it, and placed it in her arms. Ah, how well he felt himself repaid for his labor and his long walk, when he saw the little one's eyes grow bright with pleasure. She hugged the kitty tight to her breast, as if it had been a precious gem, and would not let it go for a single moment. The fever was quieted, the pain grew less, and she fell into a sweet and refreshing sleep. Claus laughed and whistled and sang all the way home. Never had he been so happy as on that day. When he entered his house, he found Shiegra, the lioness, awaiting him. Since his babyhood, Shiegra had loved Claus, and while he dwelt in the forest, she had often come in to visit him at Nasile's bower. After Claus had gone to live in the Laughing Valley, Shiegra became lonely and ill at ease. And now she had braved the snowdrifts, which all lions abhor, to see him once more. Shiegra was getting old, and her teeth were beginning to fall out, while the hairs that tipped her ears and tail had changed from tawny yellow to white. Claus found her lying on his hearth, and he put his arms around the neck of the lioness and hugged her lovingly. The cat had retired into a far corner. She did not care to associate with Shiegra. Oh yeah. Yeah. Blinky has got all the sass. Claus told his old friend about the cats he had made, and how much pleasure they had given Weekum and the sick girl. Shiegra did not know much about children. Indeed, if she met a child, she could scarcely be trusted not to devour it. But she was interested in Claus's new labors, and said, "These images seem to me very attractive, yet I cannot see why you should make cats, which are very unimportant animals. Suppose now that I am here, you can make the image of a lioness, the queen of all beasts. Then indeed your children will be happy, and safe at the same time. Claus thought this was a good suggestion, so he got a piece of wood and sharpened his knife, while Shiegra crouched upon the hearth at his feet. With much care he carved the head in the likeness of the lioness, even to the two fierce teeth that curved over her lower lip and the deep, frowning lines above her wide-open eyes. When it was finished, he said, "You have a terrible look, Shiegra." "Then the image is like me," she answered, "for I am indeed terrible to all who are not my friends." Claus now carved out the body, with Shiegra's long tail trailing behind it. The image of the crouching lioness was very lifelike. "It pleases me," said Shiegra, yawning and stretching her body gracefully. "Now I will watch while you paint." He brought the paints the Ryls had given him from the cupboard, and colored the image to resemble the real Shiegra. The lioness placed her big, padded paws upon the edge of the table, and raised herself while she carefully examined the toy that was her likeness. "You are indeed skillful," she said proudly. "The children will like that better than cats, I am sure." Then, snarling at Blinky, who arched her back in terror and whined fearfully, she walked away toward her forest home with stately strides. Alright, sass goes both ways. Fair enough. Cats being cats, no matter the size. Alright. So, let's continue now with Chapter 4. How Little Mary Became Frightened. The winter was over now, and all the Laughing Valley was filled with joyous excitement. The brook was so happy at being free once again that it gurgled more boisterously than ever, and dashed so recklessly against the rocks that it sent showers of spray high in the air. The grass thrust its sharp little blades upward through the mat of dead stalks where it had hidden from the snow, but the flowers were yet too timid to show themselves, although the Ryls were busy feeding their roots. The sun was in remarkably good humor, and sent his rays dancing merrily throughout the valley. Claus was eating his dinner one day, when he heard a timid knock on his door. "Come in!" No one answered, but after a pause came another rapping. Claus jumped up and threw open the door. Before him stood a small girl holding a smaller brother fast by the hand. Is you Claus?" she asked shyly. "Indeed I am, my dear," he answered with a laugh, and he caught both children in his arms and kissed them. "You are very welcome, and you come just in time to share my dinner." He took them to the table and fed them with fresh milk and nut cakes. When they had eaten enough, he asked, "Why have you made this long journey to see me?" "I want a tat," replied little Mary, and her brother, who had not yet learned to speak many words, nodded his head and exclaimed like an echo, "Tat!" "Oh, you want my toy cats, do you?" returned Claus, greatly pleased to discover that his creations were so popular with the children. The little visitors nodded eagerly. "Unfortunately," he continued, "I have but one cat now ready, for I carried 2 children in the town yesterday, and the one I have shall be given to your brother, Mary, because he is the smaller, and the next one I make shall be for you." The boy's face was bright with smiles as he took the precious toy Claus held out to him, but little Mary covered her face with her arm and began to sob grievously. I want a tat now," she wailed. Her disappointment made Claus feel miserable for a moment. Then he suddenly remembered Shiegra. "Don't cry, darling," he said smoothly. "I have a toy much nicer than a cat, and you shall have that." He went to the cupboard and drew out the image of the lioness, which he had placed on the table before Mary. The child raised her arm and gave one glance at the fierce teeth and the glaring eyes of the beast, and then uttered a terrified scream. She rushed from the house. The boy followed her, also screaming lustily, and even dropping his precious cat in his fear. For a moment, Claus stood motionless, being puzzled and astonished. Then he threw Shiegra's image into the cupboard and ran after the children, calling to them not to be frightened. Little Mary stopped in her fright in a flight, and her brother clung to her skirt. But they both cast fearful glances at the house, until Claus had assured them many times that the beast had been locked in the cupboard. "Yet, why were you frightened at seeing it?" he asked. "It is only a toy to play with." It's bad," said Mary decidedly, and just horrid. Not a bit nice, like cats." "Perhaps you are right," returned Claus thoughtfully. "But if you will return with me to the house, I will soon make you a pretty cat." So they timidly entered the house again, having faith in their friend's words. And afterward they had the joy of watching Claus carve out a cat from a bit of wood and paint it in natural colors. It did not take him long to do this, for he had become skillful with his knife by this time, and Mary loved her toy the more dearly because she had seen it made. After his little visitors had trotted away on their journey homeward, Claus sat long in deep thought, and he then decided that such fierce creatures as his friend Linus would never do as models from which to fashion his toys. "There must be nothing to frighten the dear babies," he reflected, "and while I know she aged well, and am not afraid of her, it is but natural that children should look upon her image with terror. Hereafter I will choose such mild-mannered animals as squirrels and rabbits and deer and lambkins from which to carve my toys, for then the little ones will love rather than fear them." He began his work that very day, and before bedtime he had made a wooden rabbit and a lamb. They were not quite so lifelike as the cats had been, because they were formed from memory, while Blinky had sat very still for Claus to look at while he worked. But the new toys pleased the children nevertheless, and the fame of Claus's playthings quickly spread to every cottage on plain and in village. He always carried his gifts to the sick or crippled children, but those who were strong enough walked to the house in the valley to ask for them. So a little path was soon worn from the plain to the door of the toy-maker's cottage. First came the children who had been playmates of Claus, before he began to make toys. These, you may be sure, were well supplied. Then children who lived farther away heard of the wonderful images and made journeys to the valley to secure them. All little ones were welcome, and never a one went away empty-handed. This demand for his handiwork kept Claus busily occupied, but he was quite happy in knowing the pleasure he gave to so many of the dear children. His friends, the immortals, were pleased with his success and supported him bravely. The Knooks selected for him clear pieces of soft wood, that his knife might not be blunted in cutting them. The Rills kept him supplied with paints of all colors and brushes fashioned from the tips of timothy grasses. The fairies discovered that the workmen needed saws and chisels and hammers and nails, as well as knives, and brought him a goodly array of such tools. Claus soon turned his living room into a most wonderful workshop. He built a bench before the window and arranged his tools and paints so that he could reach everything as he sat on his stool. And as he finished toy after toy to delight the hearts of little children, he found himself growing so gay and happy that he could not refrain from singing and laughing and whistling all the day long. "It's because I live in the Laughing Valley, where everything else laughs," said Claus. But that was not the reason. That's the end of chapter 4. So we're starting to see how the more modern conception of Santa Claus is coming into play here. The toys are coming into work, the workshop, and the little friends that are always available for help. So it's all starting to come together. We're starting to see the bigger picture forming into place. But there's a lot more to this story. We're not even quite halfway yet. So let's continue. Chapter 5. How Bessie Blithesome Came to the Laughing Valley. One day, as Claus sat before his door to enjoy the sunshine while he busily carved the head and horns of a toy deer, he looked up and discovered a glittering cavalcade of horsemen approaching the valley. When they drew nearer, he saw that the band consisted of a score of men-at-arms, clad in bright armor and bearing in their hands spears and battle-axes. In front of these rode little Bessie Blithesome, the pretty daughter of the proud Lord of Lurd, who had once driven Claus from his palace. Her palfrey was pure white, Its bridle was covered with glittering gems, and its saddle draped with cloth of gold, richly embroidered. The soldiers were sent to protect her from harm while she journeyed. Claus was surprised, but he continued to whittle and to sing until the cavalcade drew up before him. Then the little girl leaned over the neck of her palfrey and said, "Please, Mr. Claus, I want a toy." Her voice was so pleading that Claus jumped up at once and stood beside her, but he was puzzled how to answer her request. "You are a rich lord's daughter," said he, "and have all that you desire." "Except toys," said Bessie. "There are no toys in all the world but yours." "And I make them for the poor children, who have nothing else to amuse them," continued Claus. "Do poor children love to play with toys more than rich ones?" asked Bessie. "I suppose not," said Claus, thoughtfully. "Am I to blame because my father is a lord? Must I not be denied the pretty toys I long for because other children are poorer than I?" she inquired earnestly. "I'm afraid you must, dear," he answered, "for the poor have nothing else with which to amuse themselves. You have your pony to ride, your servants to wait on you, and every comfort that money can procure." "But I want toys!" cried Bessie, wiping away the tears that forced themselves into her eyes. "If I cannot have them, I shall be very unhappy." Claus was troubled, for her grief recalled to him the thought that his desire was to make all children happy, without regard to their condition in life. Yet, while so many poor children were clamoring for his toys, he could not bear to give one of them to Bessie Blithesome, who had so much already to make her happy. "Listen, my child," he said gently. "All the toys I am now making are promised to others, but the next shall be yours, since your heart so longs for it. Come to me again in 2 days, and it shall be ready for you." Bessie gave a cry of delight, and leaning over her pony's neck, she kissed Claus prettily upon his forehead. Then, calling to her men-at-arms, she rode gaily away, leaving Claus to resume his work. "If I am to supply the rich children as well as the poor ones," he thought, "I shall not have a spare moment in the whole year. But is it right I should give to the rich? Surely I must go to Necile and talk with her about this matter." So, when he had finished the toy deer, which was very like a deer he had known in the forest glades, he walked into Berzy and made his way to the bower of the beautiful nymph Necile, who had been his foster mother. She greeted him tenderly and lovingly, listening with interest to his story of the visit of Bessie Blithesome. "And now, tell me," said he, "shall I give toys to rich children?" "We of the forest know nothing of riches," she replied. "It seems to me that one child is like another child, since they are all made of the same clay, and that riches are like a gown, which may be put on or taken away, leaving the child unchanged. But the fairies are guardians of mankind, and no mortal children better than I. Let us call the Fairy Queen." This was done, and the Queen of the Fairies sat beside them, and heard Claus relate his reasons for thinking the rich children should get along without his toys, and also what the nymph had said. "Necile is right," declared the Queen, "for, whether it be rich or poor, a child's longings for pretty playthings are but natural. Rich Bessie's heart may suffer as much grief as poor Mary's. She can be just as lonely and discontented, and just as gay and happy. I think, friend Claus, it is your duty to make all little ones glad, whether they chance to live in palaces or in cottages." "Your words are wise, fair Queen," replied Claus, "and my heart tells me they are as just as they are wise. Hereafter all children may claim my services." Then he bowed before the gracious fairy, and kissing Necile's red lips, went back into his valley. At the brook he stopped to drink, and afterward he sat on the bank and took a piece of moist clay in his hands while he thought what sort of toy he should make for Bessie Blithesome. He did not notice that his fingers were working the clay into shape until, glancing downward, he found he had unconsciously formed a head that bore a slight resemblance to the nymph Necile. At once he became interested. Gathering more of the clay from the bank, he carried it into his house. Then, with the aid of his knife and a bit of wood, he succeeded in working the clay into the image of a toy nymph. With skillful strokes, he formed a long, waving hair on the head and covered the body in a gown of oak leaves, while the 2 feet sticking out of the bottom of the gown were clad in sandals.
The clay was soft, and Claus found he must handle it gently to avoid ruining his pretty work. Perhaps the rays of the sun will draw out the moisture and cause the clay to become hard, he thought. So he laid the image on a flat board and placed it in the glare of the sun. This done, he went to his bench and began painting the toy deer. And soon he became so interested in the work that he forgot all about the clay nymph. The next morning, happening to notice it as it lay on the board, he found the sun had baked it to the hardness of stone, and it was strong enough to be safely handled. Claus now painted the nymph with great care in the likeness of Necile, giving it deep blue eyes, white teeth, rosy lips, and ruddy brown hair. The gown he colored oak leaf green. And when the paint was dry, Claus himself was charmed with the new toy. Of course, it was not nearly so lovely as the real Necile, but considering the material of which it was made, Claus thought it was very beautiful. When Bessie, riding upon her white palfrey, came to his dwelling the next day, Claus presented her with the new toy. The little girl's eyes were brighter than ever as she examined the pretty image, and she loved it at once, and held it close to her breast, as a mother does to her child. "What is it called, Claus?" she asked. Now, Claus knew that nymphs do not like to be spoken of by mortals, though he could not tell Bessie that it was an image of Necile he had given her. But as it was a new toy, he searched his mind for a name to call it by, and the first word he thought of, he decided would do very well. "It is called a dolly, my dear," he said to Bessie. "I shall call the dolly my baby," returned Bessie, kissing it fondly, "and I shall tend it and care for it just as nurse cares for me. Thank you very much, Claus. Your gift has made me happier than I have ever been before." And then she rode away, hugging the toy in her arms, and Claus, seeing her delight, thought he would make another dolly, better and more natural than the first. He brought more clay from the brook, and remembering that Bessie had called the dolly her baby, he resolved to form this one into a baby's image. That was no difficult task to the clever workman, and soon the baby dolly was lying on the board and placed in the sun to dry. Then, with the clay that was left, he began to make an image of Bessie Blithesome herself. This was not so easy, for he found he could not make the silken robe of the Lord's daughter out of the common clay. So he called the fairies to his aid, and asked them to bring him colored silks, with which to make a real dress for the clay image. The fairies set off at once on their errand, and before nightfall they returned, with a generous supply of silks and laces and golden threads. Claus now became impatient to complete his new dolly, and instead of waiting for the next day's sun, he placed the clay image upon his hearth and covered it over with glowing coals. By morning, when he drew the dolly from the ashes, it had baked as hard as if it had lain a full day in the hot sun. Now our Claus became a dressmaker as well as a toy maker. He cut the lavender silk and neatly sewed it into a beautiful gown that just fitted the new dolly. He put a lace collar around its neck and pink silk shoes on its feet. The natural color of baked clay is a light gray, but Claus painted the face to resemble the color of flesh, and he gave the dolly Bessie's own brown eyes and golden hair and rosy cheeks. It was really a beautiful thing to look upon, and sure to bring joy to some childish heart. While Claus was admiring it, he heard a knock at his door, and little Mary entered. Her face was sad, and her eyes red with continued weeping. "Why, what has grieved you, my dear?" asked Claus, taking the child in his arms. I broke my tat," sobbed Mary. "How?" he inquired, his eyes twinkling. I dropped him, and broke off his tail, and I dropped him and broke off his ear, and now him's all spoilt." Claus laughed. "Never mind, Mary dear," he said. "How would you like this new dolly instead of a cat?" Mary looked at the silk-robed dolly, and her eyes grew big with astonishment. Oh, Claus!" she cried, clapping her small hands together with rapture. "Can I have that beautiful lady?" "Do you like it?" "I love it," she said. "It's better than tats." "Then take it, dear. Be careful not to break it." Mary took the dolly with a joy that was almost reverent, and her face dimpled with smiles as she started along the path toward home. All right, that is the end of chapter 5. So we've seen the expansion of Klaus's repertoire from just whittled cats to painted cats to other animals to now dolls. The great inventor. All right, so let's continue. We can probably get one more chapter in tonight, I think. And so we have chapter 6, The Wickedness of the Ogwaz. I must now tell you something about the Ogwaz, that terrible race of creatures which caused our good Claus so much trouble and nearly succeeded in robbing the children of the world of their earliest and best friend. I do not like to mention the Ogwaz, but they are a part of this history and cannot be ignored. They were neither mortals nor immortals, but stood midway between those classes of beings. The Ogwaz were invisible to ordinary people, but not to immortals. They could pass swiftly through the air from one part of the world to another, and had the power of influencing the minds of human beings to do their wicked will. They were of gigantic stature, and had coarse, scowling countenances, which showed plainly their hatred of all mankind. They possessed no consciences whatsoever, and delighted only in evil deeds. Their homes were in rocky, mountainous places, from whence they sallied forth to accomplish their wicked purposes. The one of their number that could think of the most horrible deed for them to do was always elected the King Ogwa, and all the race obeyed his orders. Sometimes these creatures lived to become 100 years old, but usually they fought so fiercely among themselves that many were destroyed in combat, and when they died, that was the end of them. Mortals were powerless to harm them, and the immortals shuddered when the Ogwaz were mentioned, and always avoided them. So they flourished for many years unopposed, and accomplished much evil. I am glad to assure you that these vile creatures have long since perished and passed from the earth. But in the days when Claus was making his first toys, they were a numerous and powerful tribe. One of the principal sports of the Ogwaz was to inspire angry passions in the hearts of little children, so that they quarreled and fought with one another. They would tempt boys to eat of unripe fruit, and then delight in the pain they suffered. They urged little girls to disobey their parents, and then would laugh when the children were punished. I do not know what causes a child to be naughty in these days, but when the Ogwaz were on Earth, naughty children were usually under their influence. Now, when Claus began to make children happy, he kept them out of the power of the Ogwaz, for children possessing such lovely playthings as he gave them had no wish to obey the evil thoughts the Ogwaz tried to thrust into their minds. Therefore, one year, when the wicked tribe was to elect a new king, they chose an Ogwa, who proposed to destroy Claus and take him away from the children.
There are, as you know, fewer naughty children in the world since Claus came to the Laughing Valley and began to make his toys,
said the new king, as he squatted upon a rock and looked around at the scowling faces of his people.
Why, Bessie Blithesome has not stamped her foot once this month, nor has Mary's brother slapped his sister's face or thrown the puppy into the rain barrel. Little Weekum took his bath last night without screaming or struggling, because his mother had promised she should not take his toy cat to bed with him. Such a condition of affairs is awful for any Ogwa to think of. And the only way we can direct the naughty actions of children is to take the person Claus away from them.
Good, good! Cried the big Ogwas in a chorus, and they clapped their hands to applaud the speech of the king.
But what shall we do with him?
Asked one of the creatures.
I have a plan,
replied the wicked king. And what his plan was, you will soon discover. That night, Claus went to bed feeling very happy, for he had completed no less than 4 pretty toys during the day, and they were sure, he thought, to make 4 little children happy. But while he slept, the band of invisible Ogwas surrounded his bed, bound him with stout cords, and then flew away with him to the middle of a dark forest in far-off Ethop, where they laid him down and left him. When morning came, Claus found himself thousands of miles from any human being, a prisoner in the wild jungle of an unknown land. From the limb of a tree above his head swayed a huge python, one of those reptiles that are able to crush a man's bones in their coils. A few yards away crouched a savage panther, its glaring red eyes fixed full on the helpless Claus. One of those monstrous spotted spiders whose sting is death crept stealthily toward him over the matted leaves, which shriveled and turned black at its very touch. But Claus had been raised in Burzee and was not afraid. "Come to me, ye nooks of the forest!" he cried, and gave the low, peculiar whistle that the nooks knew. The panther, which was about to spring upon its victim, turned and slunk away. The python swung itself into the tree and disappeared among the leaves. The spider stopped short in its advance and hid beneath a rotting log. Claus had no time to notice them, for he was surrounded by a band of harsh-featured nooks, more crooked and deformed in appearance than any he had ever seen.
"Who are you to call on us?"
demanded one in a gruff voice. "The friend of your brothers in Burzee," answered Claus. "I have been brought here by my enemies, the Aguas, and left to perish miserably. Yet now I implore your help to release me and send me home again."
"Have you the sign?"
asked another. "Yes," said Claus. They cut his bonds, and with his free arms he made the secret sign of the nooks. Instantly they assisted him to stand upon his feet, and they brought him food and drink to strengthen him.
"Our brothers of Burzee make queer friends,"
grumbled an ancient nook whose flowing beard was pure white.
"But he who knows our secret sign and signal is entitled to our help, whoever he may be. Close your eyes, stranger, and we will conduct you to your home. Where shall we seek it?"
"'Tis in the Laughing Valley," answered Claus, shutting his eyes.
"There is but one Laughing Valley in the known world, so we cannot go astray,"
remarked the nook. As he spoke, the sound of his voice seemed to die away, so Claus opened his eyes to see what caused the change. To his astonishment, he found himself seated on the bench by his own door, with the Laughing Valley spread out before him. That day he visited the wood nymphs and related his adventure to Queen Zerline and Necile. "The Aguas have become your enemies," said the lovely queen thoughtfully, "so we must do all we can to protect you from their power." "It was cowardly to bind him while he slept," remarked Necile with indignation. "The evil ones are ever cowardly," answered Zerline, "but our friend's slumber shall not be disturbed again." The queen herself came to the dwelling of Claus that evening and placed her seal on every door and window to keep out the Aguas. And under the seal of Queen Zerline was placed the seal of the fairies, and the seal of the rills, and the seal of the nooks, that the charm might become more powerful. And Claus carried his toys to the children again, and made many more of the little ones happy. You may guess how angry the King Agua and his fierce band were when it was known to them that Claus had escaped from the forests of Ithop. They raged madly for a whole week, and then held another meeting among the rocks.
"It is useless to carry him where the nooks reign," said the king, "for he has their protection. So let us cast him into the cave of our own mountains, where he will surely perish."
This was promptly agreed to, and the wicked band set out that night to seize Claus, but they found his dwelling guarded by the seals of the immortals, and were obliged to go away baffled and disappointed.
"Never mind," said the king. "He does not sleep always."
Next day, as Claus traveled to the village across the plain, where he intended to present a toy squirrel to a lame boy, he was suddenly set upon by the Aguas, who seized him and carried him away to the mountains. There they thrust him within a deep cavern and rolled many huge rocks against the entrance to prevent his escape. Deprived thus of light and food, and with little air to breathe, our Claus was indeed in a pitiful plight. But he spoke the mystic words of the fairies, which always command their friendly aid, and they came to his rescue and transported him to the Laughing Valley in the twinkling of an eye. Thus the Aguas discovered they might not destroy one who had earned the friendship of the immortals. So the evil band sought other means of keeping Claus from bringing happiness to children, and so making them obedient. Whenever Claus set out to carry his toys to the little ones, an Agua, who had been set to watch his movements, sprang upon him and snatched the toys from his grasp, and the children were no more disappointed than was Claus when he was obliged to return home disconsolate. Still he persevered, and made many toys for his little friends, and started with them for the villages, and always the Awgwas robbed him as soon as he had left the valley. They threw the stolen playthings into one of their lonely caverns, and quite a heap of toys accumulated before Claus became discouraged and gave up all attempts to leave the valley. Then children began coming to him, since they found he did not go to them, but the wicked Awgwas flew around them and caused their steps to stray and the paths to become crooked, so never a little one could find a way into the Laughing Valley. Lonely days now fell upon Claus, for he was denied the pleasure of bringing happiness to the children whom he had learned to love. Yet he bore up bravely, for he thought surely the time would come when the Awgwas would abandon their evil designs to injure him. He devoted all his hours to toy making, and when one plaything had been completed, he stood it on a shelf he had built for that purpose. When the shelf became filled with rows of toys, he made another one, and filled that also, so that in time he had many shelves filled with gay and beautiful toys representing horses, dogs, cats, elephants, lambs, rabbits, and deer, as well as pretty dolls of all sizes, and balls and marbles of baked clay painted in gay colors. Often, as he glanced at this array of childish treasures, the heart of good old Claus became sad. So greatly did he long to carry the toys to his children. And at last, because he could bear it no longer, he ventured to go to the great Ak, to whom he told the story of his persecution by the Awgwas, and begged the Master Woodsman to assist him. And that is the end of Chapter 6, and a good place to end for the night, because we come, at the next chapter, we have a clash between the Immortals and the Awgwas, good and evil. So, let's go ahead and wrap up here for the night. This has been a fun story so far. This is not really it's not quite shaping up as you would expect a story about Santa to be. But at the same time, all the pieces still fit. The colors of the pieces may not be quite what you expect yet, but the shape and the whole picture is definitely coming together. So, we're about halfway through, so I expect we'll probably finish this tomorrow. And things will come more into a recognizable shape as we go. I've been having fun with this so far. I'm glad you are too. It's a nice sort of divergence from some of the other stories we've had. It's not full of itself, as Dickens can tend to be. Although Christmas Carol was pretty earthy and easy to take in. It's not serious in any way. This is every bit the children's story. It reminds me a lot of Wizard of Oz, which makes sense. It's the same author. And it has a lot of the same sort of vibes. The world building, the nonsensical words that are pulled from imagination and spun into shape. So it's a nice, comfy read. I'm enjoying this. This is one of those that I've seen the adaptation a few times, but it wasn't in the prime rotation of the old days. Like, it wasn't on the Christmas VHS. But it was still seen from time to time. And the story of it is actually pretty solidly translated into the adaptation. So, I'm pretty happy with this so far. Alright guys, let's go ahead and wrap up for the night. We'll be back tomorrow night at our normal time, where we should finish this. We are right about at the halfway mark. So, until then, I hope you have a wonderful night, and as we approach, happy holidays. Have a great night. Good night, everyone. Thank you always for joining us.